In the depths of winter, when hunger spoke louder than conscience, a small village made a choice that would echo through the centuries. Hello, friends, and welcome to tonight's story. I want you to settle in comfortably now, perhaps adjusting your pillow, letting your breathing slow as I share with you a tale from long ago. This is not a story meant to frighten, but rather to understand, to witness the humanity that persists even in our darkest hours. It takes place in the year 1348, during a time when the world itself seemed to be ending, and I invite you to journey with me to a small village nestled in the mountains of what we now call central France, though the people there would not have called it by that name. They called their home simply the Valley, and for generations it had been enough. The winter of 1348 came early to the valley, arriving in late October with winds that seemed to carry voices of the dead. But then again, everything seemed to carry the voices of the dead that year. The great mortality, the pestilence, the thing that later generations would call the Black Death, had swept through their region like a scythe through summer wheat, and it had left so few standing. In the village, which had once held perhaps 300 souls, there remained only 47 by the time the first snows began to fall. 47 people, most of them weakened by illness or grief or both, facing a winter that promised to be particularly cruel. Among those who remained was a woman named Marguerite, though almost everyone called her Magda. She was 32 years old, which made her an elder now, strange as that seemed. Just a year ago, she would have been considered in the prime of her life, with her mother and grandmother still living, with the village priest who had baptized her still offering Mass each Sunday, with the old men who had fought in the wars still gathering at the tavern to tell their stories. But the pestilence had taken them all. Her mother had died in July, covered in the terrible buboes that marked the disease, crying out for water that Magda could not give her fast enough. Her grandmother had followed 3 days later, and Magda had been grateful, in a terrible way, that it had been so quick. The priest had died in August, and after that there had been no one to offer last rites, no one to bless the bodies, no one to maintain the rituals that had structured life for as long as anyone could remember. Magda had survived, though she did not know why. She had tended to the sick, had washed the bodies, had breathed the same air as the dying, and yet the disease had passed her by. Others had survived too, of course. There was Thomas the blacksmith, a huge man whose arms were still thick with muscle despite the months of reduced rations. There was young Beatrice, only 14, whose entire family had perished, and who now lived in a house meant for 9 but occupied only by her. There was old Henry, who everyone had expected to die first, being nearly 70, but who had somehow remained untouched by the pestilence, and who now, in his bewilderment at still being alive, wandered the village paths talking to people who were no longer there. The village sat in a valley carved by an ancient glacier, surrounded on 3 sides by steep mountains. In summer, this made it a paradise, a secret green world where the soil was rich and the streams ran clear. In winter, it became a trap. The mountain passes would close with snow, sometimes as early as November, and would not open again until April. The villagers had always known this, had always prepared for it, laying in stores of grain and salted meat, preserving vegetables in the root cellars, smoking fish from the autumn runs. But this year, the preparation had been impossible. Too many had been sick. Too many had died before the harvest could be fully brought in. The fields had stood full of grain into September, and much of it had been lost to rain and rot before the handful of survivors could gather it in. By the time November arrived, Thomas the blacksmith had done the calculations. He had gone from house to house, from cellar to cellar, taking inventory of what remained. The numbers were not good. They had perhaps enough grain for 2 months if they were careful. They had some salt pork, not much, and a few dozen smoked fish. There were turnips and onions in the cellars and some dried beans. It was not enough. Even with their reduced numbers, even with so few mouths to feed, it was not enough to last until spring. Thomas had called a meeting in the church because it was the largest building and because even without a priest, it still felt like the proper place to gather for important decisions. The survivors had come, all 47 of them, sitting in pews that had been filled with 300 just a year before. The empty spaces seemed to echo with absence. Children who were no longer there to fidget during mass, old women who would never again whisper prayers. Young men who had died before they could marry, before they could inherit their father's trades, before they could become the people they were meant to be. Thomas had stood at the front near the altar, though he had not presumed to stand behind it. He was not a religious man particularly, but he knew the boundaries. He had laid out the situation in his plain way, without embellishment, without false hope. They did not have enough food. They could ration what they had, make it last as long as possible, but even with the strictest rationing, they would run out sometime in January. After that, there would be nothing until the passes opened, which might be February if they were lucky, but was more likely March or even April. The silence that had followed his words had been complete. Even old Henry had stopped his muttering. Young Beatrice had stared at her hands, folded in her lap. Magda had looked around at the faces of the survivors, these people she had known all her life, and had tried to imagine which of them would be the first to starve, which would be the last. Then, from the back of the church, a voice had spoken. It belonged to a man named Remai, a hunter who had survived the pestilence along with his wife and young son. Remai was perhaps 40, lean and weathered, with the kind of eyes that could spot a deer 100 paces into the forest. He said, "There are bodies." At first, no one understood what he meant. Or perhaps they understood but could not quite believe they had heard correctly. Magda had felt her breath catch in her throat. Surely he did not mean what she thought he meant. But Remai had continued, his voice steady, matter of fact, as if he were discussing where to set snares for rabbits. "There are more than 200 buried in the churchyard," he said. "Most of them went into the ground in the last 4 months. The ground is frozen now, but we could dig them up. The cold has preserved them." The silence that followed was different from the silence before. This was not the silence of despair, but of horror, of a boundary being named that everyone had hoped would remain unspoken. Magda had felt her stomach clench. She had washed and prepared many of those bodies. Her mother was in that churchyard, her grandmother, her husband who had died in June, and her two sons who had followed him within a week. Thomas, the blacksmith, had been the first to find his voice. "We cannot," he had said, and his voice had shaken, this huge man who never showed fear. "That is not done. That is not Christian. That is not human." But Remai had not backed down. He had come forward, walking up the aisle between the pews, and he had stood beside Thomas. "What is human?" he had asked. "Is it human to let my son starve to death when there is food available? Is it human to watch young Beatrice die for the sake of bodies that feel nothing, know nothing, care nothing about what happens to them now? The dead are dead. We are alive. Which matters more?" An argument had erupted then, voices rising in the church, echoing off the stone walls. Some had been horrified by the very suggestion, calling it blasphemy, calling it sin, saying they would rather die than commit such an act. Others had been quieter, more thoughtful, asking questions about what God would truly want, whether survival was itself a form of obedience to the divine will that had kept them alive when so many others had perished. Still others had said nothing, had simply sat and stared, wrestling with thoughts they had never imagined having. Magda had found herself thinking of her sons. Jean had been 8 when he died, Robert only 5. She remembered the weight of their bodies as she had carried them to the church, remembered the way Robert's small hand had fallen from the shroud, and how she had tucked it back in so gently, as if she might hurt him. The thought of someone digging them up, of their small bodies being used in such a way, made her feel physically ill. And yet, she was still alive. Young Beatrice was still alive. Remai's son, who was only 6, was still alive. What was owed to the dead and what was owed to the living? It was a question that had no easy answer, no answer at all perhaps. The meeting had gone on for hours, until the winter light fatting through the church windows had dimmed to darkness, and Thomas had lit candles so they could continue. In the end, no decision had been made that night. Thomas had suggested they all go home, think, pray if they still knew how to pray, and gather again in 2 days' time. Everyone had agreed to this, grateful perhaps for the delay, for the chance to push the terrible choice a little further into the future. Magda had walked home through the snow, her breath making clouds in the freezing air. She lived alone now, in a house that had held 5. Her husband had been a carpenter, and he had built the house himself, adding rooms as the children came. Now those rooms stood empty, and Magda kept to the kitchen mostly, where she could maintain a fire without using too much wood. She had prepared a thin soup that night, mostly water with some barley and an onion, and she had eaten it slowly, trying to make it feel like more than it was. Sleep had not come easily. She had lain in her bed, the one she had shared with her husband for 12 years, and she had thought about the question Remai had posed. What is human? She had always believed she knew the answer to that question. Humans were the creatures who buried their dead, who honored them, who prayed for their souls. Humans were different from the animals precisely because they did such things, because they recognized something sacred in the body, even after the soul had departed. But humans were also the creatures who loved, who protected, who fought to preserve life. If she had to choose between these two human impulses, which should take precedence? She had thought about a story her grandmother had told her once, a story from the old days before the village had been fully Christian, when people still half believed in the old gods of the forest and the mountain. In that story, there had been a winter so harsh that the wolves had come down from the heights and attacked the village. The villagers had fought them off, had killed many of them, and then, because they were starving, they had eaten the wolves they had killed. Magda's grandmother had not told this story as if it were shameful. She had told it as if it were simply what people did to survive, what anyone would do. But wolves were not people. Wolves were not your mother, your husband, or your children. The 2 days had passed, and the village had gathered in the church again. This time, the discussion had been shorter, more focused. A kind of grim pragmatism had settled over the group. Thomas had laid out the options again, making sure everyone understood the stakes. If they did nothing, they would likely all die. If they tried to make it over the passes now, before the worst of the winter set in, most would die in the attempt, and those who survived would have no guarantee of finding help on the other side. The pestilence had struck everywhere after all. Villages on the other side of the mountains might be in no better shape than their own, might have no food to spare even if they could be reached. That left Remai's suggestion. And slowly, person by person, the survivors had begun to acknowledge that they saw no other choice. Not everyone agreed. There were 4 people who said they would rather die, who said they would take no part in such an act. Magda had respected them for that, for holding to their principles even in the face of death. But she had also thought they were wrong in a way, because their dying would not help anyone, would not bring anyone back, would not make the choice any less terrible for those who made it. In the end, 38 people had agreed to what they began to call the necessity. That was the word they used, because none of them could bring themselves to speak more plainly about what they were going to do. It was necessary, they told themselves. It was survival, nothing more, nothing less. They were not monsters. They were not demons. They were people who wanted to live. The question then became how to proceed. There was the practical matter of the digging, of course. The ground was frozen, and it would be hard work to break through. Thomas had suggested they start with the graves that were most recent, where the soil had not had as much time to freeze solid. That meant the graves from October, from late September. Magda had felt relief at that, shameful as it was, because her family had been buried in June and July. They would not be disturbed, at least not at first. But there was also the question of preparation, of how to make the meat safe to eat, how to divide it fairly, how to preserve it so it would last. These were not questions anyone had ever expected to have to answer, but they had to be answered nonetheless. Remai the hunter had some knowledge from his work with game. He knew about butchering, about smoking and salting, about which parts of an animal were best for eating and which were better used for other purposes. He had offered to oversee this work, and no one else had wanted the responsibility, so it had fallen to him. They had agreed to wait until after dark to begin the digging. It was not that there was anyone to hide from, anyone who might see and judge them. It was simply that the act felt like something that should be done in darkness, in secret, even if the only witnesses were themselves and God. A group of 10 men had gone to the churchyard that first night, Thomas among them, Ramai among them, each carrying a shovel or pick. Magda had stayed home, but she had not been able to sleep. She had imagined them out there in the cold, in the moonlight, breaking through the frozen earth, lifting bodies that had once been their neighbors, their friends, their family. They had brought back 4 bodies that night. Magda had heard about it the next morning from her neighbor, a woman named Elise who had lost her husband and daughter to the pestilence. Elise had been one of the women who agreed to help with the preparation, the cutting and cleaning that would need to be done. She had told Magda that the bodies had been remarkably well preserved by the cold, that they looked almost as they had when they went into the ground, except for a certain stiffness, a certain waxy quality to the skin. The men had brought them to an empty barn at the edge of the village, a place that could be kept cold, where the work could be done away from the living spaces. Magda had not asked for more details. She had not wanted to know more than she had to know. But over the following days and weeks, she had learned things anyway, because in a village of 47 people, there were no real secrets. She had learned that Ramai had approached the work with a hunter's efficiency, treating the bodies as he would treat a deer or a boar. She had learned that some of the women who had volunteered to help had been unable to continue after the first day, had been overcome by what they were doing, and had had to be replaced by others who were more able to distance themselves from the reality of it. She had learned that Thomas the blacksmith had insisted on saying a prayer over each body before the work began, a kind of apology, a recognition that what they were doing was wrong even if it was necessary. The meat had been distributed in portions, carefully measured to ensure fairness. Each person received an equal share based on their age and needs. The children received slightly more than the adults, and the elderly slightly less, though old Henry had protested this, saying he would not take less than his share, saying he had lived long enough to have earned equal treatment. In the end, they had given him an equal portion because it was not worth arguing about, and because they all suspected he would not survive the winter regardless. Magda had received her portion wrapped in cloth, the meat already salted, already cut into pieces suitable for adding to soups and stews. She had taken it home, had placed it in her cold cellar, and had not looked at it for 3 days. The idea of eating it, of actually putting it in her mouth, chewing it, swallowing it, had seemed impossible. But then the hunger had become too great, and her ration of grain had run out for the week, and she had no choice. She had made a stew with turnips and onions, had added a small piece of the meat, and had cooked it until it was very tender, until it looked like nothing more than any other stew she had ever made. The first bite had been the hardest. She had sat at her table, the spoon halfway to her mouth, and she had thought, I cannot do this. But then she had thought of her sons, Jean and Robert, and she had thought that if they could see her now, they would want her to live. They would not want her to starve to death for the sake of honoring bodies that were no longer theirs, that were just shells, empty vessels. The soul was gone after all. That was what the priest had always taught. The body was nothing without the soul. It was just clay, just meat, just matter. So she had eaten, and it had tasted like any other meat, perhaps a bit tougher, perhaps a bit different in some ways she could not quite name, but not dramatically so. She had eaten, and she had survived another day. This became the pattern of life in the village that winter. Every few weeks, when the stored meat ran low, the men would go to the churchyard at night and bring back more bodies. They had worked their way through the October graves, then the September graves, then began to move backward in time toward the summer graves. Magda had known that eventually they would reach the graves of her family, but she had tried not to think about it, had tried to focus on the present, on getting through each day. The 4 people who had refused to participate in the necessity had kept to their principles. They had survived on their own meager stores, supplemented by the charity of others who shared their grain and vegetables, though not their meat. By December, one of them had died, an elderly woman who had simply gone to sleep one night and not woken up. The others had said it was starvation, but Magda had thought it might have been something else, a simple loss of will, a decision that life was no longer worth fighting for. By January, a second had died, a man in his 50s who had been weak with illness even before the food ran out. The other 2 still held on, though they were skeletal now, barely able to walk. The village had fallen into a strange new routine. During the day, people went about the tasks of survival. They tended the fires, they melted snow for water, they tried to keep the paths clear, they looked after the children. They had organized a kind of school in one of the houses, where the few who could read and write taught the children their letters. It was important, they felt, to maintain some sense of normalcy, some sense that the future would eventually arrive, and that when it did, the children would need to be ready for it. But at night, there was a quality of silence in the village that went beyond the usual quiet of winter. It was the silence of shared guilt, of shared shame, of shared knowledge that they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. People did not visit each other as they once had. They did not gather in the evenings to tell stories or share news. They stayed in their own homes, kept to themselves, as if proximity might make the truth of what they were doing more real, more impossible to bear. Magda had found herself thinking often about the nature of sin. The old priest would have said that what they were doing was a mortal sin, a violation of natural law, a crime against God. But the old priest was dead, and there was no one to hear confession, no one to grant absolution, no one to guide them through the moral wilderness they found themselves in. So they had to decide for themselves what was sin and what was survival, what was forgivable and what was not. She had concluded in her own mind that intention mattered. They were not eating the dead out of cruelty, or out of pleasure, or out of disrespect. They were doing it because the alternative was death, the extinction of their entire community, and the loss of everyone who had survived the pestilence. Surely God, if he existed, if he was watching, if he cared, would understand that. Surely there was room in divine mercy for people who were simply trying to live. But even as she thought this, she was not entirely convinced. There were nights when she would wake in the darkness, her heart pounding, her mouth dry, and she would think, I have become a monster. I have done the unthinkable. I have violated the most basic human taboo. And no amount of reasoning, no amount of justification could make that feeling go away entirely. As January turned to February, the villagers began to notice changes in themselves. Some reported dreams, terrible dreams in which the dead came to them and spoke. Old Henry claimed he could hear voices in the wind, calling his name, asking him why he had betrayed them. Young Beatrice became withdrawn, speaking less and less, spending hours staring at nothing. Thomas the blacksmith, who had been the strongest among them, began to lose weight rapidly, despite eating his full ration. Remai's wife, a woman named Marie, had developed a nervous habit of washing her hands constantly, scrubbing them until they were raw, saying she could not get them clean. Magda noticed these changes in others, but she also noticed them in herself. She had developed an aversion to looking at her own reflection. The one mirror in her house, which had belonged to her mother, had turned to face the wall. She did not want to see her own face, did not want to confront the person she had become. She also found that she was sleeping less and less. When she did sleep, she dreamed of her sons, but they were different in their dreams. They were accusing her, asking her how she could have let such things happen, asking her why she was still alive when they were not. In February, the question came that everyone had been dreading. The men had worked through most of the graves in the churchyard, and they were running low on bodies that were still relatively well preserved. Thomas had come to Magda one evening, standing at her door with his hat in his hands, looking uncomfortable. He had asked if they could come into her house, have a private conversation. She had let him in, had offered him a seat by the fire, though she had not offered him food, because food was too precious now for casual hospitality. Thomas had explained the situation. They had reached the June and July graves, the ones from the height of the pestilence, when people had been dying so fast that burial had been hasty, disorganized. Among those graves were Magda's family. Her husband Pierre, her sons Jean and Robert, her mother Claudine, her grandmother Margaret. Thomas wanted to know if Magda would give permission for those graves to be opened, or if she wanted them to be left undisturbed. Magda had felt something break inside her when he asked this question. She had known it was coming, had known from the beginning that eventually all the graves would be needed, but the reality of it was different from the anticipation. She had sat in silence for a long time, looking into the fire, trying to find words for something that had no words. Finally, she had said, "If you leave them alone, will someone else have to give up their family instead? Will you dig up Elise's daughter? Will you dig up Remai's father?" Thomas nodded. "Yes," he had said. "If we leave some graves untouched, we have to take more bodies from other graves. There is no way to make this fair, except to treat all the dead equally." Magda had understood the logic of this, had seen that there was no good answer, no answer that would make anyone happy. "Then dig them up," she had said, her voice flat, emotionless. "They are dead. They do not know. Do what you must." Thomas had left after that, and Magda had sat by the fire for hours, not moving, barely breathing. She had thought about her husband, about the way he used to hold her hand when they walked, about the way he laughed at his own jokes even when no one else found them funny. She had thought about Jean, who had wanted to be a blacksmith like Thomas, who had spent hours watching the forge, fascinated by the transformation of metal from one shape to another. She had thought about Robert, who had been afraid of the dark and who had needed his mother to sit with him every night until he fell asleep, and who had never had the chance to outgrow that fear. And she had thought with a kind of terrible clarity that if there was a God, he had abandoned them. Not just her village, but all of humanity. The pestilence had been bad enough, had been horror enough, but to then force the survivors into this position, to make them choose between starvation and desecration, that was a cruelty beyond comprehension. What kind of God would allow such a thing? What kind of God would create a world in which such choices had to be made? She had lost her faith that night, she realized later. Whatever belief she had maintained through the pestilence, through the deaths of everyone she loved, through the necessity of eating the dead, it had finally broken under the weight of this last, unbearable thing. There was no benevolent presence watching over them, no divine plan, no promise of redemption. There was only survival, random and meaningless, and the terrible things people had to do to achieve it. The men came for the graves 3 nights later. Magda did not watch them, did not go to the churchyard, but she knew when it happened because she could feel it somehow in the marrow of her bones. She sat in her kitchen that night, utterly still, her hands folded on the table before her, and she felt the moment when they broke through the frozen earth above her sons. She could not have said how she knew, but she did. It was as if some invisible cord that had connected her to their bodies, thin and fraying but still intact, had finally been severed. When Elise brought her portion to her door the next morning, wrapped in the usual cloth, Magda had looked at it for a long moment before taking it. Elise had not met her eyes. No one could meet anyone's eyes anymore. They had all become strangers to each other, bound together only by their shared transgression, their shared guilt, their shared determination to survive no matter the cost. Magda had placed the bundle in her cellar without unwrapping it. She did not want to know if she could recognize anything, did not want to wonder which of the pieces might have belonged to Jean, which to Robert, which to Pierre. It was better not to know, better to maintain the fiction that this was just meat, just sustenance, just fuel for the body that kept her heart beating and her lungs drawing breath. But that night, when she prepared her meager stew, adding one small piece of the meat to the pot with turnips and the last of her onions, she found she could not eat it. She sat with the bowl before her, the steam rising in the cold air of her kitchen, and her body simply refused. Her throat closed. Her stomach rebelled. She tried to force herself, tried to think of it as survival, as necessity, but the knowledge was too much. This was not some stranger, some neighbor she had known only in passing. This was her family. This was the people who had made her who she was, the people she had loved more than life itself. She had pushed the bowl away and had gone to bed hungry that night, and the next night, and the night after that. She told herself she would eat when she got hungry enough, when the survival instinct overrode the moral revulsion. But days passed and still she could not bring herself to touch the meat in her cellar. She continued to eat the grain when it was available, the sparse vegetables, but her portions were smaller now, and she was growing weaker. Elise had noticed, of course. In a village of so few people, everything was noticed. She had come to Magda's house one afternoon in late February, had sat with her by the fire, and had asked, very gently, what was wrong. Magda had not wanted to explain, had not wanted to put into words something that felt too enormous, too shameful, but Elise had waited patiently, and eventually the story had come out. How Magda could not eat the meat from her own family, how the knowledge of what it was had made it impossible, how she knew she was going to starve, but she could not seem to make herself care. Elise had listened without judgment, her worn face soft with understanding. When Magda had finished, Elise had been quiet for a moment, then had said, "I will give you some of mine, and you will give me some of yours. That way, neither of us has to eat our own." It was such a simple solution, so obvious that Magda felt foolish for not having thought of it herself. But it was also an act of profound kindness, of compassion, of recognition that there were some lines that even the necessity could not force a person to cross. Magda had felt tears come then, the first she had cried since the autumn, and Elise had held her while she wept, two women who had lost everything, clinging to each other in a world that had become unrecognizable. After that, they had made the exchange, and Magda had been able to eat again, though the knowledge of what she was eating never left her, never became easier. She simply learned to carry it, the way she carried all her other griefs, all her other shames, all her other memories of the time before, when life had been different, when she had been a different person. February gave way to March, and the villagers began to watch the mountain passes with desperate hope. Every day, someone would walk up to the edge of the valley, to the place where the trail began its climb toward the pass, and would look for signs that the snow was melting, that passage might soon be possible. But March was still a deep winter in the mountains, and the snow showed no signs of relenting. If anything, there were more storms that month, great sweeping blizzards that buried the village for days at a time and made even the simple act of gathering firewood an ordeal. The food situation had become critical again. They had exhausted the bodies in the churchyard, all 243 of them, and now there was nothing left but the small stores of grain and vegetables that remained, and those were running very low. Thomas had done the calculations again, and his estimate was grim. They had perhaps 3 weeks of food, maybe 4 if they rationed severely. After that, there would be nothing. A meeting was called, and once again the survivors gathered in the church, though there were fewer of them now. 2 more of the people who had refused to eat the dead had died, leaving only one, a woman named Agnes, who was so weak she could barely walk but who still insisted she had made the right choice. Several others had died as well, from cold or illness or simply from the accumulated strain of the winter. There were 32 people left now, 32 souls where there had once been 300. Rimai had stood before them, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow, and had said what everyone already knew but no one wanted to speak aloud. "When the next person dies," he said, "we will have to use them." The words fell into the church like stones into deep water. For a long moment, no one spoke. The idea of eating someone who had been alive, who had been part of their surviving community, who had been sitting in this very church just days or weeks before, was somehow different from eating those who had died of the pestilence, who had already been reduced to bodies in the ground. It was crossing yet another line, entering yet another depth of degradation. But what choice was there? Thomas had asked this question, his voice tired, defeated. If they did not eat the newly dead, they would all become the newly dead. It was that simple, that terrible. Young Beatrice had spoken then, her voice small but clear. "What about after?" she had asked. "What happens when the pass is open and we can leave? What do we tell people? What do we say about what we did?" It was a question no one had considered, or perhaps had considered but had pushed away, had decided to deal with later, if later ever came. Rimai had looked at her for a long moment, then had said, "We tell them nothing. We say the pestilence took most of the village, and the rest died of starvation. We say we barely survived. We never speak of the rest. But people will know," Beatrice had insisted. "The graves are empty. Anyone who comes here will see that." Thomas had thought about this, then had said, "We fill them in again. Before we leave, we put the dirt back. We make it look as though the graves are still occupied, and we never come back here. We go somewhere else, start over, become different people." The idea of abandoning the village, the place where most of them had been born, where their families had lived for generations, had been painful. But it was also, Magda had realized, necessary. This place was tainted now, poisoned by what they had done. Even if the pestilence had never happened, even if the winter had been mild, the village could never be the same again. Too much had been lost. Too many lines had been crossed. Better to leave it behind, to let it become a ghost town, a mystery for travelers who might pass through years later and wonder what had happened to the people who once lived here. They had agreed then to Rimai's proposal. When the next person died, they would use the body, and they would tell no one ever what they had done to survive. Agnes died 3 days later. She was the last of those who had refused to eat the dead, and her death was in some ways a mercy, an end to her suffering, an affirmation that she had held to her principles to the very end. But it also meant that the village now had a fresh body and no more qualms about using it. The work that had become routine over the winter happened again, one last time, and Agnes was divided among the survivors, her flesh preserved and rationed out. Magda had received her portion, had accepted it with a numbness that had become her constant companion. She no longer felt horror, no longer felt shame, no longer felt much of anything. She was simply existing, putting one foot in front of the other, waiting for the winter to end, waiting for the chance to leave this place and never look back. But something had shifted in the village after Agnes's death. Perhaps it was the knowledge that they had now consumed one of their own communities, someone who had been alive and present just days before. Perhaps it was the accumulated weight of all the months of horror, all the compromises, all the violations. Whatever the reason, people began to look at each other differently. There was a new wariness, a new suspicion. If they had been willing to eat Agnes, who was to say they would not be willing to eat someone else? Someone who was still alive, but weak, but vulnerable. Magda noticed it first in the way people positioned themselves in rooms, always keeping their backs to walls, always maintaining distance from others. She noticed it in the way conversations stopped when someone entered, in the way people counted their portions obsessively, as if afraid someone might try to take what was theirs. She noticed it in the eyes of Remai's young son, who had begun to flinch away from his own father's touch. The trust that had held the community together, fragile as it had been, was fraying, and Magda understood with a cold clarity that they were in danger now not just from starvation, but from each other. The line between using the already dead and hastening death for the sake of food was thin, and they had come so close to it that she could almost see people thinking, calculating, wondering. She began to lock her door at night. She began to sleep with a knife under her pillow. She was not sure what she would do with it if someone came for her, was not sure she even had the strength to defend herself, but it gave her a small measure of comfort, an illusion of control in a situation that had long since spiraled beyond anyone's control. But then in the second week of March, something changed. The weather warmed just slightly, just enough. The snow stopped falling. The sun appeared, weak and watery but present for the first time in weeks. And Thomas, who had been checking the passes daily, came running back to the village one afternoon, shouting that the trail was clear, that the worst of the snow had melted, that they could leave. The relief was so intense it was almost painful. Magda had felt it wash over her like a wave, loosening muscles she had not realized were clenched, releasing tears she had not known she was holding. They could leave. They could escape this place, this valley that had become a prison, a hell, a place where they had done things that could never be undone but might perhaps be left behind. The survivors had gathered quickly, taking stock of what could be carried, what had to be abandoned. Most of their possessions would have to stay. They could take only what they could carry on their backs, which was essential for the journey. Food, what little remained, blankets, tools. The children could not carry much, so the adults took on heavier loads. Before they left, Thomas had organized the work he had promised, the filling in of the graves. It was hard labor, made harder by their weakened state, but they had persevered. Every grave in the churchyard was filled with dirt, the surface smoothed over, made to look undisturbed. They planted wooden crosses where the markers had been, copied the names from memory onto new pieces of wood. To anyone who came after, it would look like a village that had been devastated by pestilence, and then by starvation, where the survivors had finally fled. The terrible secret of what had actually happened would be buried with the dirt. On the morning they left, the survivors stood in a loose group at the edge of the village, looking back at the place that had been their home. Magda had looked at her house, the one Pierre had built with his own hands, where she had given birth to her sons, where she had lived her entire adult life. She had tried to feel something, some sense of loss or nostalgia, but there was nothing. The house was just a building now, empty of meaning, a shell. Everything that had made it a home was gone. They had started walking then, 32 people in a ragged line, moving slowly up the trail toward the pass. The children were in the middle of the line, the stronger adults at the front and back. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. They were leaving behind everything they had known, carrying with them only their lives and their secrets and their shame. The journey over the pass took 2 days. They had to stop frequently to rest. their bodies weak from months of inadequate food and the strain of the winter. At night, they huddled together for warmth, sleeping in shifts, always watchful, still not quite trusting each other. But the weather held, and the trail, though difficult, was passable. When they finally crested the pass and began the descent into the valley on the other side, Magda had paused to look back one last time. The village was no longer visible, hidden behind the curve of the mountain, already receding into memory, into history, into the realm of things that happened long ago to other people. She had wondered if anyone would ever learn the truth of what they had done, if somehow the secret would come out, if future generations would know and judge. But she had concluded that it did not matter. They would be dead by then, beyond judgment, beyond consequences, beyond everything. The valley on the other side of the pass was different from the one they had left. It was wider, more open, with several villages visible in the distance. As they descended, they began to see signs of life, smoke from chimneys, people working in fields that were just beginning to thaw. The pestilence had struck here too, they learned, but not as severely. These villages had lost perhaps a third of their people, not 3/4. There was still structure, still order, still a sense of normalcy. The survivors had split up then by mutual unspoken agreement. Staying together would have been too dangerous, too likely to raise questions, too likely to keep the memories fresh. Magda had gone with Elise and 3 others to a village called St. Mitchell, where they had told a carefully prepared story. They were from a small settlement in the mountains, they said. The pestilence had taken most of their people, and the winter had been harsh. They had decided to leave, to start over somewhere with more resources, more people, more chances for survival. They did not mention the name of their village. They did not say exactly where it had been. They spoke of it vaguely, as if it hardly mattered, as if it had been so small and insignificant that no one would have heard of it anyway. The people of St. Mitchell had received them with cautious kindness. They had been through their own horrors after all, and they understood loss, understood grief, understood the need to start over. They had offered work, shelter, and a chance to rebuild. Magda had found employment with a weaver, a widow who needed help with her looms. It was good work, steady work, work that kept her hands busy and her mind occupied. In the months and years that followed, Magda had built a new life. She had taken a new name, calling herself Margit now, after her grandmother. She had let people believe she had always been Margit, had always been from a vague somewhere else, had always been alone. She never spoke of her husband, her sons, or her mother. When people asked, she said simply that the pestilence had taken them, which was true if incomplete. She never spoke of the village, the winter, the necessity. Those things existed in a locked room in her mind, a room she never opened, a room whose door was sealed with will and determination, and the absolute knowledge that if she ever let it open, she would be destroyed by what came out. Elise, who lived in the same village, never spoke of it either. They would sometimes catch each other's eyes across the market square or in the church, and there would be a moment of recognition, of shared knowledge, but nothing was ever said. They had an agreement, unspoken but absolute, that the past was dead, that what had happened in the valley belonged to a different world, A different time, different people. Magda had lived for 30 more years after leaving the valley. She never married again, never had more children. She became known as a skilled weaver, a quiet woman, a little sad perhaps. But then everyone was a little sad in those years after the pestilence. She went to church every Sunday, though she never took communion, never confessed her sins, never truly prayed. She went because it was expected, because it was what people did, because maintaining the appearance of normalcy was essential to her survival. She had wondered sometimes about the others who had survived that winter. Thomas had gone to a different village, she knew. Remai and his family had gone to yet another. Young Beatrice had gone east, toward the larger towns, where anonymity was easier. They had scattered like seeds on the wind, carrying their secret with them, never to speak of it, never to acknowledge it, never to let it touch their new lives. But Magda had known with a certainty that never wavered that all of them carried the weight of what they had done, every day, every moment. It was there in their dreams, in their private thoughts, in the way they moved through the world. They had survived, yes, they had lived. But they had paid a price for that survival that was beyond calculation, beyond comprehension. They had given up not just their innocence, not just their moral certainty, but some essential part of their humanity. They had learned that the line between human and monster was not fixed, was not absolute, was something that could be crossed when necessity demanded it. And yet, Magda had also come to believe, in her quiet way, that what they had done was not unforgivable. Not because it was right, not because it was moral, but because they had been given an impossible choice, and they had made the only choice that allowed any of them to survive. They could have all died, could have held to their principles and starved with clean consciences. But then there would have been no one left, no one to remember, no one to carry forward even the possibility of redemption. She had thought often about young Beatrice, who had asked what they would tell people, who had understood even then that secrets have a weight, a cost, a way of shaping lives. Magda had wondered if Beatrice had found peace, had found a way to live with what she had done, had found love or happiness or at least contentment. She hoped so. She hoped that for all of them, that somehow they had managed to build lives that were worth the terrible price they had paid. In her final years, Magda had become increasingly frail, her body wearing out, her strength fading. She had welcomed it in a way, this slow decline toward death. She had lived long enough, had carried her burden long enough, had maintained her secret long enough. She was ready to lay it down, to close her eyes and not open them again, to finally be free of the weight of memory. She had died in the winter of 1378, 30 years after the winter of necessity, in her sleep, in her small room above the weaver's shop. The people of St. Mitchell had mourned her passing, had said kind things about her at her funeral, and had buried her in the churchyard with a simple wooden cross bearing the name Margaret. They had not known who she really was, what she had really done, what she had really survived. And that was exactly as she had wanted it. But before she died, Magda had done one thing. She had written down the story of that winter, not in detail, not with names, but in broad strokes, in a way that might help someone understand what had happened, why it had happened, how ordinary people could do extraordinary things, both terrible and heroic. She had sealed the pages in a leather pouch and had given them to the priest, with instructions that they were not to be opened for 100 years, not until everyone who had lived through the pestilence was dead, not until the story had become history rather than memory. Whether the priest had honored her wishes, Magda never knew. She had died before she could find out, but she had hoped that someday someone would read those pages and would understand. Not forgive, perhaps, not condoned, but understand. Understand that people are capable of anything when survival is at stake. Understand that morality is not absolute but contextual, shaped by circumstances, by desperation, by the basic animal need to continue existing. Understand that the village that ate its dead was not a village of monsters, but a village of people who loved life enough to do whatever was necessary to preserve it. The story of the village had passed into legend of a sort. There were rumors, whispers, tales told on dark nights about a place in the mountains where something terrible had happened during the pestilence. But the details were vague, changing with each telling, and eventually the story faded, becoming one more ghost story among many, one more mystery from a time that was already receding into myth. The village itself had been reclaimed by the forest. Without people to maintain it, the buildings had slowly collapsed, the fields had returned to wildland, the paths had disappeared beneath undergrowth. By the time anyone thought to look for it, decades after the survivors had fled, there was almost nothing left to find. Just some crumbling foundations, some overgrown graves with weathered crosses, some hints of human habitation that raised more questions than they answered. Historians would later debate whether the village had even existed, whether the story was real or apocryphal, or whether anything like what was rumored could actually have happened. Some said it was impossible, that no Christian community would ever engage in such practices, that the story was propaganda or fantasy, or the invention of those who wanted to paint the pestilence years as even darker than they were. Others said that anything was possible in those terrible times, that people had done things beyond imagining, that survival could drive humans to places they never thought they could go. But the truth, which had been carefully buried by the survivors, which had been hidden in graves filled with dirt and in lives lived under false names, remained hidden. The 32 people who had walked over the pass that March morning had kept their secret. They had taken it to their graves. They had protected each other and themselves with silence, with distance, with the careful construction of new identities that had no connection to the winter of necessity. And perhaps that was its own kind of mercy. Perhaps the world did not need to know every terrible thing that had happened during the pestilence, every compromise, every violation, every breaking of sacred bonds. Perhaps some secrets were better left buried, some stories better left untold, some truths better left in darkness. Or perhaps, and this was what Magda had believed, the story needed to be told, but only when enough time had passed that it could be heard without immediate judgment, without reflexive condemnation, without the need to hunt down and punish those responsible. Perhaps the story needed to wait until it could be understood as history, as a window into what humans are capable of under extreme duress, as a reminder that civilization is fragile, and that the things we consider unthinkable can become necessary when the world breaks down. The winter of 1348 had been such a breaking. The pestilence had shattered the social order, had killed so many so fast that the old certainties, the old moralities, the old assumptions about how life should be lived had simply collapsed. In that void, people had had to improvise, had had to make choices without the guidance of tradition or authority or clear moral frameworks. Some of those choices had been heroic. Some had been terrible. Most had been both. The village that ate its dead had been one small example of what happened when everything fell apart, when survival became the only value that mattered, when people had to choose between preserving life and preserving dignity. They had chosen life, and they had paid for that choice with their souls, or at least with their peace of mind, their sense of themselves as moral beings, their ability to ever again feel truly clean. But they had lived, they had continued, they had rebuilt. And that, Magda had concluded, was what humans did. They survived, no matter what it cost, no matter what they had to do, no matter what they had to become. And then, if they were lucky, if they were strong enough, if they were willing to carry the weight, they found a way to keep living with what they had done, to build new lives on foundations of shame and secrecy, and the desperate hope that somehow, someday, they might find a way to forgive themselves. Whether they ever did, Magda could not say. She had never forgiven herself, not truly. But she had learned to live with herself, which was perhaps the best that could be hoped for. She had learned to carry her guilt as she carried everything else, as a burden that could not be put down but that could, with practice, be borne without collapsing under its weight. And in the end, that was the real story of the village that ate its dead. Not the sensational details, not the horror of what was done, but the simple, quiet, terrible story of how people carried on afterward, how they lived with what they had become, how they found ways to keep existing in a world that had asked too much of them and had broken them in the asking. The survivors had scattered, hidden, and built new lives, but they had also, in their own ways, testified to the resilience of the human spirit, to the capacity to endure even the unendurable, to keep going even when there seemed to be no reason to go on. They have proven that people can do terrible things and still remain human, can cross lines that should never be crossed and still find ways to care, to love, to hope, to strive for something better. It was a dark lesson, perhaps, a lesson that most people would prefer not to learn, but it was also, in its way, a hopeful one. Because if people could survive that, could live through that and come out the other side still trying to be decent, still trying to do right, still trying to build lives worth living, then perhaps there was no darkness so deep that it could entirely extinguish the human capacity for persistence, for adaptation, for renewal. The village was gone now, erased by time and weather and the deliberate forgetting of those who had survived. But the people who had lived there, who had suffered there, who had made impossible choices there, they had gone on. They had carried their secret, yes, but they had also carried their humanity, damaged and compromised as it was. They had loved again, worked again, found small pleasures again. They had not been destroyed by what they had done, even though part of them had died in that valley. And perhaps that was the final truth of the story, the one that Magda had tried to capture in her hidden pages. that humans are not defined by their worst moments, by their most desperate acts, by the things they do when all other options have been exhausted. They are defined by what they do afterward, by how they carry the weight, by whether they use their survival to build something, to contribute something, to mean something in the world. The survivors of the village had done that. They had taken their broken lives and had made something of them. They had worked, had helped others, and had contributed to their new communities. They had not let the winter of necessity be the end of their stories. They had kept going, kept trying, kept living. And so the village that ate its dead became, in the end, not a story of horror but a story of survival, of the terrible price of life, of the choices people make when there are no good choices left. It became a story about the complexity of morality, about the way right and wrong blur when necessity enters the picture, about how judgment is easy from a distance but unbearably hard when you are the one standing at the crossroads, having to choose. The years passed, and the survivors of the valley aged, each carrying their secret like a stone lodged beneath the heart. Thomas the blacksmith, who had settled in a town called Beaufort, had become prosperous in his new life. His forge was known for leagues around, and he had married a widow with 2 daughters, had given them a stable home, a respectable life. But those who worked closest to him noticed that he never sang while he worked, as most smiths did. He labored in silence, his face set, his eyes distant, as if he were always somewhere else, always remembering something he wished he could forget. He had nightmares, his wife told the neighbor women, terrible nightmares from which he would wake gasping, his body drenched in sweat. She assumed they were from the pestilence, from watching so many die, and Thomas never corrected her. He let her believe this because it was easier than the truth, because the truth would have destroyed everything he had built, would have made him a monster in her eyes, in everyone's eyes. But the nightmares were not about the pestilence itself. They were about the churchyard, about the sound of shovels breaking frozen earth, about the weight of bodies that had once been people he knew, people he had laughed with and argued with and lived beside for decades. In his dreams, the dead spoke to him, asked him why, asked him how he could have done such things. And he had no answer for them that made sense, no justification that sounded anything but hollow when spoken aloud in the dream space where truth could not be hidden. Thomas had tried to make amends in his way. He had become deeply charitable, giving away more than he could afford to the poor, to orphans, to anyone who needed help. His wife sometimes protested that he was too generous, that they had their own family to think of, but Thomas could not seem to stop himself. It was as if he were trying to balance some cosmic ledger, as if enough good deeds might somehow cancel out the terrible things he had done, might earn him a place in heaven despite everything. But he knew, in his heart, that it did not work that way. There was no balancing of accounts when it came to the soul. What he had done was permanent, was indelible, was written into the fabric of his being in a way that no amount of charity could erase. He would die carrying it, would face whatever judgment awaited him carrying it, and there was nothing to be done about that except to keep living, keep working, keep trying to be decent in the time that remained. Remai the hunter had taken his family far to the south, to a region where the pestilence had been less severe, where there were still forests full of game, where a skilled hunter could make a living. He had returned to his trade, had taught his son the craft, and had tried to rebuild the life he had known before the winter of necessity. But he found that he could no longer eat meat without thinking of that winter, without remembering the barn where they had done the work, without seeing the faces of the dead superimposed on the flesh of deer and boar. He had become thin, gaunt, eating only when hunger became unbearable, and even then consuming only bread and vegetables, things that bore no resemblance to the meat of that winter. His wife Marie had noticed this change in him, but had attributed it to lingering trauma from the pestilence, to grief for all they had lost. She did not know the real reason, could not have imagined the real reason, and Remai was grateful for her ignorance. It protected her, kept her innocent, allowed her to sleep peacefully at night in a way that he never could. His son, who had been only 6 during the winter of necessity, remembered almost nothing of it. This was perhaps the greatest mercy Remai had received, that his child had been too young to fully understand what was happening, had been protected by the fog of early childhood from the worst of the memories. The boy was 12 now, strong and capable, learning to track and shoot, learning to read the forest the way Remai had once read it. Remai watched him and felt a complicated mixture of pride and sorrow, grateful that his son would have a future, but haunted by the knowledge of what had been sacrificed to ensure that future. Sometimes, Remai would go deep into the forest alone, would walk for hours until he was far from any human habitation, and there he would weep. He would let out the grief and the shame and the horror that he kept locked inside during his daily life, would release it in great racking sobs that left him exhausted and empty. These solitary journeys into the wilderness were his only form of confession, his only way of acknowledging what he had done, what he had become. The forest held his secrets without judgment, absorbed his tears without comment, and then he would return home, would resume his mask of normalcy, would continue the pretense that he was just an ordinary man who had survived an extraordinary time. Young Beatrice, who was no longer young, had made her way to Paris, that great sprawling city where anonymity was easy to come by, where no one asked too many questions about where you came from or what you had survived. She had found work as a servant in a wealthy household, had eventually married a clerk who worked for a wine merchant, had borne 3 children who knew nothing of their mother's past, who grew up believing she had come from a small village that had been decimated by the pestilence, and that was all there was to know. But Beatrice carried the winter with her in ways that shaped her entire life. She was obsessively clean, washing herself and her children and her home with a fervor that seemed excessive even in an age concerned with humors and miasmas. She could not bear to see food wasted, would become almost frantic if her children did not finish their meals, would save every scrap, every crumb in ways that puzzled her husband, but that he learned not to question. And she never, ever spoke of her childhood, of her family, of anything that had happened before she arrived in Paris. Her children sometimes asked about their grandparents, about aunts and uncles, about the extended family that other children had but that they seemed to lack. Beatrice would grow quiet at these questions, would offer only the barest details. They had all died in the pestilence. She would say all of them, and it was too painful to speak of. Eventually, the children stopped asking, sensing that this was forbidden territory, that their mother carried wounds that could not bear examination. But at night, when her husband and children slept, Beatrice would sometimes lie awake and think about the village, about her family, about the winter when she had been 14 years old, and had learned that the world was far more terrible than she had ever imagined possible. She thought about her parents, who had been among the first to die of the pestilence, and she was grateful in a way that filled her with guilt, that they had died before the winter, that they had never known what their daughter would have to do to survive, what she would have to eat, what she would have to become. She wondered sometimes if her parents' bodies had been among those used during the winter. She had never asked, had never wanted to know, because knowing would have made it worse somehow, would have made it personal in a way that she could not have borne. It was easier to think of the necessity in abstract terms, as something that had happened to bodies, to meat, rather than to specific people with specific names and faces that she had loved. Beatrice had developed a deep, almost fanatical faith in her adult years. She attended Mass every day, sometimes twice a day. She prayed constantly, her lips moving in silent petition even as she worked, even as she cooked or cleaned or tended to her children. Her husband thought it was grief, thought she was praying for the souls of her dead family, and this was partly true. But mostly she was praying for herself, begging God for forgiveness, for understanding, for some sign that what she had done was not unforgivable, that she was not damned, that her soul could still be saved. The priests she confessed to heard only partial truths. She told them she had sinned, that she carried guilt, that she needed absolution. But she never told them exactly what she had done, could never bring herself to speak those words aloud in the confession booth. The priests, assuming she was speaking of common sins, of pride or envy or minor transgressions, had given her penances that seemed laughably inadequate. Say 10 Hail Marys, light a candle, give alms to the poor. Beatrice had done all these things, had done them 1,000 times over, but the weight never lifted, the guilt never eased. She had come to believe, as the years passed, that there was no forgiveness for what she had done, at least not in this life. Perhaps in the next, if God was truly merciful, if heaven was real and reachable, there might be a chance for redemption. But in this life she would carry the winter forever, would feel its cold in her bones even on the warmest summer days, would taste its bitterness even in the sweetest honey. Elise, who had stayed in St. Mitchell with Magda, had married again, to a farmer named Robert who had lost his own wife to the pestilence. Together they had worked a small piece of land, had raised sheep, and had made a modest but comfortable life. Elise had been a good wife, a good neighbor, a woman who was known for her kindness and her willingness to help others. But those who knew her well noticed that she sometimes seemed distant, as if part of her were always somewhere else, always remembering something she could not share. She and Magda had maintained a careful friendship over the years, meeting occasionally in the market or at church, exchanging pleasantries but never speaking of substance, never acknowledging the bond that truly connected them. They were like two soldiers who had fought in the same terrible battle, and who recognized each other across a crowded square, but who could not speak of what they had endured because the words would destroy them both. Elise had 2 more children with Robert, daughters who grew up healthy and strong, who knew nothing of the winter, who lived ordinary lives full of the usual joys and sorrows. Elise loved them fiercely, protectively, with an intensity that sometimes frightened her husband. She could not bear to let them out of her sight, could not tolerate even the minor illnesses of childhood without becoming nearly frantic with worry. It was as if she feared that if she relaxed her vigilance even for a moment, death would return and claim them as it had claimed her first daughter, as it had claimed so many. Her husband attributed this to her losses during the pestilence, and again, this was partly true but not the whole truth. The whole truth was that Elise could not shake the feeling that she had bargained with darkness during that winter, that she had made a deal with forces beyond human comprehension, and that at any moment the bill might come due, the price might be extracted from her remaining children. It was an irrational fear, she knew, but knowing it was irrational did not make it less powerful, less consuming. She had nightmares too, though different from Thomas's. In her dreams, she was back in the village in her house, and her first daughter was there, alive and well, playing by the fire. But then Elise would realize she was eating something, and when she looked down at her bowl, she would see that it contained pieces of her daughter, that she was consuming her own child. She would try to stop, would try to drop the spoon, but her hand would not obey, would keep lifting food to her mouth, and she would wake screaming, her husband shaking her, asking what was wrong, what had she dreamed. And she would tell him it was nothing, just the pestilence again, just memories of the dead, and he would hold her until she calmed, never knowing the truth, never suspecting what his wife carried inside her. The other survivors had scattered far and wide, each building new lives, each carrying the secret alone. Some had died young, unable to bear the weight, succumbing to illnesses or accidents or, in a few cases, to deliberate choices to stop living. Others had lived long lives, had become grandparents and great-grandparents, had died peacefully in their beds surrounded by people who loved them, and who never knew what they had been, what they had done. But all of them, whether they lived 10 years or 50 after the winter of necessity, had been shaped by it in ways that never left them. They had learned that humans are capable of anything, that morality is not fixed but fluid, that the distance between civilization and savagery is far shorter than anyone wants to believe. They had learned that survival is not always victory, that living can be its own form of punishment, that some prices are too high even when you choose to pay them. And they had learned, perhaps most importantly, that secrets have weight, that silence has a cost, that the things you cannot speak of will eat you from the inside even more surely than hunger ever could. The winter had ended, spring had come. They had escaped the valley and built new lives. But in another sense, they had never left. Part of each of them was still there, would always be there, locked in that frozen moment when they had chosen to do the unthinkable because the alternative was death. In the year 1365, 17 years after the winter of necessity, a young monk named Brother Anselm had been traveling through the mountains on a pilgrimage when he had stumbled upon the ruins of the village. He had been struck by the sight of it, this ghost settlement with its crumbling buildings and its overgrown churchyard. He had walked through the empty streets, had stood in the doorways of abandoned houses, and had wondered what had happened here, why the people had left, where they had gone. He had examined the churchyard carefully, counting the graves, noting the dates on the crosses that were still legible. So many deaths in such a short time. The pestilence clearly had struck hard here. But there was something odd about the graves, something he could not quite identify. The dirt seemed looser than it should have been, as if the graves had been disturbed relatively recently. And there were no signs of animal predation, no evidence that wolves or foxes had dug up the bodies, which was strange given how remote the location was. Brother Anselm had felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. He had sensed that something terrible had happened in this place, something beyond the usual horrors of the pestilence. But he had not been able to determine what it was, had not been able to piece together the truth from the silent stones and empty buildings. He had said a prayer for the souls of the dead, had blessed the ground, and had continued on his journey, carrying with him a vague sense of unease, a feeling that the village held secrets that were better left undiscovered. He had told his abbot about the village when he returned to his monastery, had described its abandonment, its mysterious air. The abbot had listened with interest and had suggested that perhaps someday, when resources allowed, they might send someone to investigate more thoroughly, to determine what had happened and whether anything could be salvaged or learned. But the investigation never happened. There were always more pressing concerns, more immediate needs. The abandoned village had faded from memory, had become just one more ruin among many in a landscape scarred by the pestilence, just one more mystery that would never be solved. Magda had heard about the monk's visit years after it happened. One of the survivors, she never learned who, had traveled back to the region and had heard the story from a villager in the next valley, had then passed it along through the network of survivors who occasionally, very carefully, very discreetly, communicated with each other. The news had filled her with a cold dread. She had feared that the monk had discovered something and had seen something that would expose their secret. But apparently he had found nothing conclusive, had left with only questions, and the secret had remained safe. But the incident had reminded all of them of the fragility of their silence, of how easily the truth could come to light. They had redoubled their caution, had been even more careful about maintaining their cover stories, their false identities, their constructed pasts. They had reminded each other, through intermediaries, through coded messages, that they must never speak of the winter, must never give any indication that they had been part of something that the world could not be allowed to know. As Magda had grown older, as her body had begun to fail and death had approached, she had felt an increasing urge to tell someone, to confess, to share the burden before she died. The weight of carrying the secret alone had become almost unbearable. But she had resisted the urge, had remembered her promise to the others, had understood that speaking would endanger not just herself but all of them, and would destroy the lives they had so carefully built. And so she had kept silent, had carried the secret to her deathbed, had written it down only in the most careful way, only with the instruction that it not be read for 100 years. Whether that instruction would be followed, she could not know. But she had done what she could, had tried to balance the need for truth with the need for protection, had tried to give the story to history without destroying the people who had lived it. The pages she had written were brief, just a few sheets of parchment covered in her careful script. She had not named names, had not identified the village precisely, had not provided details that would allow anyone to track down the survivors or their descendants. She had simply told the story in its broad outlines. A village struck by pestilence, the survivors facing starvation, the terrible choice they had made, the weight they had carried afterward. She had written, "We did what we had to do to survive." Whether this was right or wrong, I cannot say. I know only that we were human beings in an impossible situation, that we chose life over death, and that we have paid for that choice every day since. Judge us if you must, but judge us with the knowledge that you have never faced what we faced, have never had to make the choices we made. And pray that you never do. The priest to whom she had given the pages had been puzzled by her request, had asked why she wanted them sealed for so long, what they contained that was so sensitive. Magda had told him only that they were a record of the pestilence years, a testimony that would be of interest to future historians, but that was too painful to be read by anyone who had lived through that time. The priest had accepted this explanation, had sealed the pages as requested, and had placed them in the monastery's archive with a notation about when they could be opened. Whether anyone ever read them, Magda never knew. She died 3 days after giving the pages to the priest, died quietly in her sleep, her body simply giving out after 7 decades of life. The people of St. Mitchell had mourned her passing, had said kind words at her funeral, and had buried her with dignity and respect. They had known her as Margaret the Weaver, a quiet woman who had survived the pestilence and had lived a decent if somewhat solitary life. They had not known that she was Marguerite, survivor of the winter of necessity, keeper of one of the darkest secrets of the age. Elise had died a few years later, her heart giving out suddenly one morning as she worked in her garden. Robert had found her there, lying among the vegetables she had been tending, her face peaceful, her hands still holding the hoe. He had wept for her, had buried her in the churchyard, had told their daughters that their mother had been a good woman, a strong woman who had endured much and had still found ways to love and to give. And this was true as far as it went. It was just not the whole truth. Thomas had lived to be 70, an impressive age for that time, and had died in his forge, working until the very end. His wife had found him slumped over his anvil, the hammer still in his hand, a piece of iron still glowing on the forge. The people of Beaufort had mourned him deeply, had praised him as a skilled craftsman and a generous neighbor, had told stories about his kindness to the poor and his willingness to help anyone who needed it. They had built his funeral pyre high and had sent him off with honor, never knowing what demons he had wrestled with in the privacy of his own mind. Remai had died in the forest, the place where he had always felt most at home. He had gone out hunting one winter morning and had not returned. His son had found him 3 days later, sitting against a tree, his bow across his lap, looking almost as if he had simply decided to rest for a moment and had then slipped away. There was no sign of injury, no indication of what had killed him. The assumption was that his heart had failed, or perhaps the cold had taken him. But his son had wondered, though he never said so aloud, whether his father had chosen this ending, had walked into the forest knowing he would not walk out again, had finally allowed himself to stop fighting, stopped carrying whatever burden he had carried for so long. Beatrice had lived the longest of all the survivors, making it to 78 years of age. She had outlived her husband, had seen her children grow and marry and have children of their own, and had become a great-grandmother before she died. In her final years, she had become deeply devout, spending hours each day in prayer, attending every Mass, every Vespers, every service the church offered. Her family had thought she was preparing her soul for heaven, making ready to meet God, and in a sense they were right. But they did not know that she was also trying, one final time, to find forgiveness for something she could never confess, to make peace with a past that could never be spoken. On her deathbed, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, Beatrice had tried to tell them something, had tried to explain, to confess, to finally release the burden. But the words had not come. Her throat had closed, her voice had failed, and all she had been able to do was weep, tears streaming down her weathered face as her family had held her hands and had told her it was all right, that she could let go, that she had lived a good life and that God would welcome her home. They had thought her tears were from fear of death or from the pain of leaving them. They had not known that she was weeping for the winter of necessity, for the girl she had been, for the innocence she had lost, for the secret she had carried for 64 years and would now carry into eternity. And so, one by one, the survivors of the village died, and their secret died with them. The winter of the necessity passed out of living memory, became history, became legend, became myth. The village itself disappeared completely, its last stones crumbling into the earth, its last traces erased by time and weather, and the patient work of the forest reclaiming what was its own. Generations passed. The world changed. The pestilence became something that had happened long ago, a disaster that people read about in old chronicles, but that no longer touched their daily lives. New plagues came and went. New wars were fought. New kingdoms rose and fell. The world turned, as it always does, and the story of the small village in the mountains was forgotten entirely, except perhaps as a vague rumor, a whispered tale told to frighten children, a maybe it happened, maybe it didn't kind of story that no one took very seriously. But the truth remained, buried in sealed pages in a monastery archive, waiting for the 100 years to pass, waiting for someone to break the seal and read the words that Magda had written, waiting to be known, to be understood, to be judged by a future that might have the distance and the perspective to see it for what it was. Not a story of monsters, but a story of humans pushed beyond their limits, forced to make choices that should never have to be made, surviving in the only way they knew how. Whether those pages were ever read, whether anyone ever learned the truth, is a question that history cannot answer. Perhaps they were destroyed in a fire, or lost in a flood, or simply mislaid and forgotten in the depths of the archive. Perhaps they were read and then deliberately destroyed by someone who found the contents too disturbing, too dangerous, too likely to cause harm if they became widely known. Or perhaps they were read and preserved, kept as a testament to what humans are capable of, both terrible and enduring, a reminder that judgment is easy but understanding is hard, and that the line between right and wrong is not always as clear as we would like it to be. The story of the village that ate its dead is, in the end, a story about survival and its costs, about the choices people make when all choices are terrible, about the weight of secrets and the burden of memory. It is a story that asks uncomfortable questions about morality and necessity, about what it means to be human, about how we judge the past and how the past judges us. It is also a story about silence, about the things we cannot speak of, about the way secrets shape lives and communities and histories. The survivors of the winter chose silence, chose to bury the truth as deeply as they had buried the bones, chose to build new lives on a foundation of carefully maintained deception. Was this the right choice? Would it have been better to confess, to face judgment, to let the truth be known regardless of the consequences? There is no easy answer to this question. The survivors made the choice they felt they had to make, just as they had made the choice to do what was necessary to survive the winter. They protected themselves, protected each other, protected their children and grandchildren from the taint of knowledge that would have marked them as the descendants of cannibals, as the inheritors of an unspeakable legacy. And in doing so, they also protected the memory of the dead in a strange way. Because if the truth had become known, the people who had died in the village would have been remembered only for what had been done to their bodies, would have been reduced to victims of a horror story, would have lost their identities as individuals who had lived and loved and mattered. By keeping silent, the survivors allowed the dead to rest in obscurity, to be forgotten entirely rather than to be remembered in the worst possible way. Perhaps this was mercy. Perhaps this was just another form of violation. Perhaps it was both. The world is rarely simple, and the moral calculations of desperate people in desperate times resist easy categorization. What remains is the story itself, passed down through the centuries in whispers and fragments, never quite verified, never quite dismissed, hovering in the space between truth and legend. A village in the mountains, a terrible winter. Choices that should never have to be made. Survivors who carried the weight of those choices for the rest of their lives. And silence, the deep, enduring silence of secrets that are too terrible to speak, that reshape those who carry them, that echo through time long after everyone involved has turned to dust. And so we come to the end of this story, though endings are never as final as we might wish them to be. The village that ate its dead exists now only in these words, in the imagination of those who hear the tale and try to understand what it must have been like to live through such a time, to make such choices, to carry such weight. The actual place is gone, reclaimed by the earth, its stones scattered, its graves empty and unmarked, its secrets buried so deeply that no archaeologist will ever uncover them, no historian will ever prove them, no one will ever know for certain what happened there in the winter of 1348. But perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps some stories are meant to exist in the space of possibility rather than certainty, meant to make us think and question and wonder rather than to provide us with comfortable answers and clear judgments. The survivors of that winter would have wanted it this way, would have wanted their story to fade into shadow, to become uncertain, to lose its sharp edges, until it was no longer a specific accusation, but a general meditation on what humans are capable of when pushed to their limits. They were not heroes, these survivors, but they were not monsters either. They were simply people who loved life enough to do terrible things to preserve it, who then had to find ways to live with what they had done, who carried their guilt and their shame and their memories in silence, because speaking would have destroyed not just themselves, but everyone they had come to love in the years after the winter. There is something almost unbearably human about this, about the way they chose survival and then chose silence, about the way they rebuilt their lives on foundations of secrecy, about the way they loved their new children and worked their new jobs and prayed their prayers, all while carrying a darkness inside them that could never be shared. We are all, in our way, keepers of secrets. We all have things we cannot speak of, things that would change how others see us if they knew. The survivors of the village simply carried a heavier burden than most, a secret so profound that it reshaped everything they were. And yet they endured. They lived. They found moments of joy even in the shadow of their guilt. They laughed with their children. They felt the sun on their faces. They tasted good wine and heard beautiful music and experienced all the small pleasures that make life worth living. The winter of necessity did not destroy them, even though it changed them forever. They proved that it is possible to do terrible things and still remain human, still care for others, still hope for redemption even when redemption seems impossible. This, perhaps, is the final lesson of the story. Not that survival justifies anything, not that necessity erases guilt, but simply that humans have a remarkable capacity to carry on, to keep living even when living seems unbearable, to find meaning even in the wake of horror. The survivors of the village found ways to matter again, to contribute, to love. They did not let the worst thing they had ever done become the only thing they ever were. As you drift now toward sleep, let this story settle in your mind not as a tale of horror, but as a meditation on the complexity of being human, on the way we are all shaped by our choices, on the weight we all carry in ways that others cannot see. The survivors of the village are long dead now, their bones mingled with the earth, their secrets finally silent. But their story remains, a reminder that judgment is easy from a distance, but understanding requires us to imagine ourselves in circumstances we hope we never face, making choices we hope we never have to make. Sleep now and let the story rest with you, not as a nightmare but as parable, not as condemnation but as recognition of the full range of human experience, the terrible and the transcendent, the shameful and the resilient. The village is gone, the winter is over. The survivors have found whatever peace awaits beyond this life. And we, the living, are left to wonder what we would have done, who we would have become, and how we would have carried on. The story is finished now. The winter has ended. The secret has been told at last to whoever might listen across the centuries. And in the telling, perhaps, some small measure of the burden has been lifted, some weight shared, some understanding reached. Rest well, friends. The darkness of that winter is long past. Morning will come again as it always does. And life, stubborn and persistent and infinitely precious, will continue. Good night.